Take a slow breath and allow your thoughts to loosen their grip. The world does not need you right now, and nothing is waiting for your response. Somewhere far back in time, where days passed without urgency and nights were lit by oil lamps instead of clocks, Egypt moved at its own ancient pace. The Nile flowed as it always had, steady and unbothered, carrying silt, memory, and silence from the south toward the waiting sea. Long before Cleopatra's name would echo through Roman halls and modern imagination, Egypt had already learned how to endure. Kingdoms had risen and fallen here without announcement. Dynasties had faded quietly, leaving only worn carvings and half-forgotten prayers behind. By the time the Ptolemaic family ruled from Alexandria, Egypt itself was older than their ambitions, older than their rivalries, older than their bloodlines. Alexandria rested at the edge of land and water, a city built to face outward while Egypt itself looked inward. Ships arrived daily, their sails folding without ceremony. Merchants spoke softly, philosophers argued gently, and scribes bent over papyrus with practiced patience. The great library did not shout its importance. It waited, filled with rooms where knowledge slept quietly in the dark. Inside the royal palace, life unfolded slowly. Courtyards opened to the sky. Pools reflected moonlight without disturbance. Servants moved carefully, their footsteps softened by stone polished smooth over generations. Nothing in the palace encouraged haste. Even power was expected to move gracefully. Royal children were born into this stillness. They learned early that silence was not emptiness, but protection. Tutors spoke in measured tones. Lessons were repeated, not rushed. Greek philosophy, Egyptian ritual, Roman awareness, each layer added gently, never forced. The children listened more than they spoke. Watching was as important as learning. Among these children were sisters who shared blood, teachers, and walls, but not futures. Cleopatra was not alone in the palace corridors. She was surrounded by siblings whose names would later be whispered or erased, depending on who survived long enough to speak. Arsinoe, younger but watchful, moved through the palace with a quiet alertness. She learned where voices lowered when she entered a room. She noticed how servants adjusted their posture around different members of the royal family. She absorbed these details without comment, storing them the way Egypt stored floodwaters, patiently, without display. Cleopatra Selene, still younger, grew up in the shadow of events she could not yet understand. For her, the palace was simply the world, columns, gardens, soft footsteps, and the distant sound of waves against stone. Power was not yet a concept. Safety felt permanent. Childhood lingered gently, unaware of how fragile it truly was. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long relied on controlled tension to survive. Brothers married sisters. Sisters competed quietly. Alliances shifted not through speeches, but through absence. A name mentioned less often. A seat left empty. A presence no longer acknowledged. Rome watched all of this with patient interest. At first, Rome was only a distant influence. Letters carried across the sea, envoys arriving with polite smiles, agreements spoken calmly over shared meals. But Rome did not hurry. Rome never needed to. It waited for cracks to widen on their own. Within the palace, daily routines continued unchanged. Lamps were lit at dusk. Meals were served at the same hour. Musicians played softly in the evenings, their melodies floating through open corridors and fading into night air. The repetition gave comfort. It also gave the illusion that nothing was shifting beneath the surface. Arsinoe grew older and more aware. She understood without being told. that lineage alone did not guarantee survival. She watched Cleopatra carefully. Her confidence, her ease in conversation, her ability to command attention without raising her voice. Admiration and calculation lived close together, never fully separating. Rivalry did not arrive loudly. It seeped in slowly, like water finding hidden paths through stone. When political tension finally entered the palace openly, it did so under the guise of necessity. Decisions were framed as unavoidable, actions were justified as protective. Each move was presented as calm and reasonable, even as it narrowed the future for others. Arsinoe found herself pushed into roles she had not chosen. Supporters gathered quietly. Words like legitimacy and tradition were spoken in careful tones. She became, without ceremony, a figure of opposition, not because she demanded it, but because the structure of power required alternatives to exist. Cleopatra Selene watched all of this from a distance. Adults spoke around her, not to her. She learned to remain still, to make herself small, to observe without reacting. In silence, she memorized faces, voices, and moods. These memories would later become her armor. When Rome finally stepped fully into Egypt's internal struggles, it did so with overwhelming calm. Soldiers arrived not as invaders, but as stabilizers. Decisions were enforced politely, efficiently. Resistance, once crushed, was not discussed again. Arsinoe's fate unfolded away from the palace she had known. Her removal was framed as resolution. Her name faded quickly from official speech. History, written by those who remained, grew quieter around her existence. Cleopatra Selene's world collapsed without noise. One day, familiar faces were gone. The next, she was no longer in Egypt at all. Rome did not treat her cruelly. It treated her impersonally, which was worse. She became part of a procession, a symbol rather than a child, carried through streets she did not recognize beneath skies that felt too wide. In Rome, time moved differently. Stone replaced sand. The river flowed, but it did not flood. Rituals were rigid. Silence carried different meanings. Selene learned to adapt by observing. Just as she had in Alexandria, survival became quiet endurance. Years passed. Empires shifted. Cleopatra Selene grew into adulthood away from her birthplace, carrying Egypt within her memory rather than beneath her feet. She married, ruled briefly in distant lands, and lived a life shaped more by what she had lost than what she controlled. Back in Egypt, the Nile continued as it always had. Fields were planted, harvests returned. Children were born who would never hear the names of the sisters who once walked palace corridors beneath painted ceilings. History moved on, efficient and selective. Names that did not serve power faded. Stories softened. Rivalries were reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. What remained was the rhythm, the slow rise and fall of water, the repetition of days, the endurance of land beyond individual lives. And as centuries passed, Egypt slept beneath layers of time, holding within it the quiet memory of sisters who lived, observed, endured, and disappeared without ceremony. The Nile flowed on. The river did not remember their names, but it carried their reflections all the same. Each night, moonlight stretched across the Nile in thin silver paths, breaking and reforming with the slow movement of water. Villages along its banks slept in rhythm with the current, unaware of how many lives had passed through palaces now quiet and empty. In Alexandria, the palace that once held whispered rivalries settled into a softer existence. Rooms that had echoed with lessons and low arguments were repurposed or abandoned. Curtains faded. Paint chipped gently from walls painted to resemble the heavens. Servants came and went, never asking who had once occupied which chamber. Memory was not part of their duty. Time smoothed everything. The Ptolemaic dynasty, once so tightly wound around itself, loosened and unraveled without spectacle. Rome absorbed what remained with administrative calm. Egypt became a province, a resource, a line item in distant ledgers. Grain shipments mattered more than bloodlines now. The past was useful only when it justified the present. Cleopatra Selene, far from the Nile, learned how to live with this kind of forgetting. In Roman cities and later in North Africa, she moved through structured days filled with ceremony and restraint. Her speech was careful, her posture precise. She carried herself with the composed stillness of someone who had learned early that attention could be dangerous. At night she remembered Egypt. Not the politics or the fear, but the texture of it. Stone warmed by the sun, the scent of lotus carried on evening air, the sound of sandals crossing courtyards long after dark. These memories came softly, without urgency, like familiar songs heard faintly through walls. She did not speak of them often. Memory, like power, was something to handle discreetly. Others from the old court disappeared into anonymity. Tutors returned to private life. Musicians played in smaller halls. Guards were reassigned, their loyalty absorbed by new banners. Each person carried fragments of what had been, but no one assembled them into a full picture. History prefers simplicity. Far away, Arsinoe's story ended quietly, preserved only in scattered records and cautious mentions. She became a warning rather than a person. A reminder that proximity to power did not ensure safety. Her life, once full of observation and potential, narrowed until it vanished from official memory. And yet, Egypt itself remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. Farmers rose before dawn. Fields flooded and receded. Children learned to walk on paths worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The rhythm of daily life continued without reference to who had ruled before or who would rule again. In this continuity, there was a kind of mercy. Empires thrived on distinction, but land endured through repetition. The same sun warmed the same soil. The same stars appeared night after night, indifferent to names once carved beneath them. The river flowed with equal patience past ruins and new settlements alike. If one listened carefully in the quiet hours, Egypt still spoke not of triumph or rivalry, but of persistence. Cleopatra Selene lived long enough to understand this. Her later years were measured and composed. She fulfilled her role where she could, blending Roman order with echoes of Egyptian heritage, so subtle that few recognized them. Symbols appeared quietly in architecture, in coinage, in ceremony, small acknowledgments rather than declarations. She did not seek to revive what had been lost. She understood that survival often meant adaptation, not resistance. When her life finally ended, it did so without spectacle. No dramatic final act, no lingering conflict. Just a closing of breath, followed by silence. Another life absorbed into the slow accumulation of history. Back in Egypt, her name was already fading. Generations passed who knew Cleopatra only as a distant legend, stripped of sisters, stripped of nuance. The story simplified itself for convenience. Rivalries became footnotes. Women became shadows, complexity softened into myth. Yet beneath this smooth surface, the land held everything. Every footstep across palace floors had left a trace. Every whispered conversation had stirred the air. Every quiet decision had shaped futures that extended far beyond their moment. None of it was truly lost. only redistributed into the fabric of time. Night returned again and again to the Nile. Water reflected stars, insects hummed softly. Boats drifted with lanterns glowing faintly, their movements slow enough to seem almost still. Somewhere along the river, a child slept, dreaming without knowing whose footsteps once echoed beneath the same sky. History rested here, not as a story told loudly, but as a presence felt gently. And as the hours passed, the world continued its calm rotation. Empires rose elsewhere. New names demanded attention. But Egypt remained, breathing steadily, patient as ever. Let your thoughts follow the river now. There is no need to remember dates or faces. No need to hold on to conclusions. Everything important has already settled where it belongs. The water moves on. The night deepens. And the past, having done its work, grows quiet once more. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was full in the way ancient places are full, layered with moments that no longer needed to be spoken. Along the Nile, night deepened and softened, and the land rested in the familiar way it always had, trusting the return of morning without needing to anticipate it. Long after the Ptolemies were gone, traces of their world lingered in small, unremarkable ways. A carved stone reused in a farmer's wall. A fragment of painted plaster buried beneath newer foundations. A name half erased on a broken relief, no longer read aloud but still present, still real. People passed these remnants without stopping. Life required attention elsewhere. Crops needed tending. Children needed feeding. The present, as it always does, claimed priority over memory. In Alexandria, the harbor continued its steady rhythm. Ships arrived and departed under different flags, carrying grain, wine, and letters meant for distant capitals. The sea remained unchanged, indifferent to who controlled its ports. Waves touched stone, withdrew, and returned again, repeating the same motion that had once carried Cleopatra's family to and from the palace docks. The palace itself became quieter with each generation. Some halls were sealed, others repurposed. Eventually, even the idea of it blurred, absorbed into newer structures and shifting coastlines. What had once been the center of attention slowly became background, then absence. And yet, for those who knew how to listen, the land still spoke. At dusk, when the heat loosened its hold, the air filled with familiar scents, earth cooling, water settling, faint smoke from cooking fires. These sensations connected the present to the distant past more faithfully than any written record. They were shared experiences, unbroken by conquest or time. Cleopatra's sisters, forgotten by name, remained present in this continuity, not as figures of power, but as human lives that had moved through the same sensory world. They had felt the same evening breeze, heard the same insects, watched the same river darken under the same sky. In this sense, they were never truly gone. Time passed gently, stacking years without emphasis. Children grew old and became elders. Elders faded quietly. The land accepted each transition without judgment, just as it always had. Sometimes stories surfaced briefly, a traveler repeating a half-remembered tale, a scholar pausing over a damaged text. These moments of recollection never lasted long. Memory flared softly, then returned to rest. That too was part of the rhythm. If you imagine Egypt now, imagine it without drama. Picture fields stretching calmly beneath the sun. Boats drifting slowly, their oars dipping in unison. Villages settling into night with the same unhurried certainty that guided them centuries before. Power had moved on, but life had not been interrupted. The sisters who once lived at the center of empire had become part of this wider, quieter existence. Their struggles no longer demanded attention. Their ambitions no longer pressed against the future. What remained was simply that they had lived, and that was enough. Let your thoughts slow here. There is nothing left to resolve. No lesson waiting at the end. Only the steady presence of a world that continues whether or not it is remembered. The river flows. The night holds. And everything finds its place in time. The hours move forward without marking themselves. Somewhere between night and early morning, the air cooled further, and the land settled into a deeper stillness. Egypt had always known how to wait. Waiting was woven into its soil, its seasons, its long memory of survival. With the coming of dawn, light spread gradually across the riverbanks. It did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded, revealing shapes slowly, palm trees first, then water, then distant structures softened by haze. This same light had once entered palace windows and temple doorways alike, touching royal chambers and humble homes with equal patience. In these early hours, the past felt closest. It was in moments like this that the lives of Cleopatra's sisters seemed almost near again, not as figures of history, but as quiet presences woven into the landscape. They had woken to mornings like this, listened to birds along the river, felt stone floors cool beneath bare feet. Their days had begun not with ambition, but with routine. Routine, more than power, defined their lives. Royal schedules were rigid yet calm, meals at set hours. Lessons repeated daily, ceremonies performed with precision. Even uncertainty followed predictable patterns. Decisions were postponed until the proper moment. Reactions were measured. Emotion was something to be contained, not displayed. Arsinoe had learned this discipline early. She understood the importance of composure, of appearing unthreatening even while being observed. In a world where attention could lead to danger, subtlety became a form of protection. Cleopatra Selene absorbed these lessons without realizing she was doing so. As a child, she simply adapted. Silence became familiar. Observation felt natural. She learned to exist within spaces without disturbing them, a skill that would serve her long after Egypt was no longer her home. These habits followed her across borders. In foreign courts, she noticed the same patterns repeating under different names. Power still required performance. Survival still favored restraint. She recognized these truths instinctively. Shaped by a childhood spent in the shadow of an ancient empire already fading. Egypt, meanwhile, continued its quiet persistence. New rulers brought new laws, new languages, new symbols of authority. But the land itself remained uninterested in these changes. Fields flooded as they always had. Stone endured. The desert watched without comment. People adjusted. They always did. Markets opened at dawn. Traders called softly to one another. Goods passed hands. Coins changed designs. The act of exchange remained unchanged. Life found stability not in who ruled, but in what repeated. This repetition softened memory. Over time, the sharp edges of past conflict blurred. Rivalries lost their urgency. Stories shortened. What could not be easily summarized was set aside. History became smoother, more manageable, and less complete. Cleopatra's sisters became part of this smoothing. Their individuality faded first. Their complexities followed. Eventually, only faint outlines remained, references without depth, mentions without voice. Silence settled around them, not as punishment, but as consequence. And yet silence was not absence. Beneath it, everything remained stored, in land, in stone, in the unbroken rhythm of days. The Nile did not distinguish between remembered and forgotten. It carried all things equally. As morning fully arrived, Egypt returned to motion. Boats departed. Fields filled with workers. The night released its hold gently, without ceremony. Another day began, unremarkable and complete. If you listen closely now, you can almost hear the continuity, the soft overlap of centuries folding into one another. No single moment stands apart. No life exists in isolation. Everything is connected by the simple fact of having occurred. The sisters lived. They moved through rooms. They watched the river. They endured, and then they became part of the quiet. There is no need to search further. No need to recover what time has settled. The world continues carrying all of it forward, whether named or unnamed. Let your thoughts rest here, where nothing is required and everything is already complete. As the day lengthened, the heat rose gently from the earth, and the sounds of work blended into a steady, unremarkable hum. This was how Egypt had always sounded when nothing extraordinary was happening, which was most of the time. History often remembered moments of rupture, but life existed mainly in the spaces between them. In those spaces, people lived without awareness of how close they stood to stories that would one day be simplified or forgotten. Children played near the riverbanks. Elders rested in shaded doorways. Voices rose and fell, not in argument, but in conversation shaped by familiarity. These ordinary moments formed the true continuity of the land. Long ago, Cleopatra's sisters had known these same rhythms, even while living behind palace walls. Royal life was separated by privilege, but not entirely removed from repetition. Days followed structure. Nights followed silence. Even anxiety followed a pattern, appearing and retreating with predictable restraint. The palace, despite its grandeur, was not loud. Sound was absorbed by stone and distance. Curtains softened echoes. Courtyards opened space between voices. This architecture encouraged calm, even when emotions beneath the surface were restless. In such an environment, rivalry did not announce itself. It unfolded slowly, almost politely. Shifts in influence were detected through subtle changes. Fewer invitations, altered seating, conversations redirected rather than denied. Those who noticed these changes early learned how to adjust. Those who did not often vanished quietly from relevance. Arsinoe had been attentive to these movements. She learned to read rooms rather than declarations. She understood when silence carried more meaning than speech. These skills kept her present longer than some, but not long enough to secure safety. In a system built on exclusion, attentiveness could delay loss, but not always prevent it. Cleopatra Selene absorbed the aftermath rather than the conflict itself. By the time she understood what had been lost, it had already been reshaped into memory. Absence became familiar. She grew accustomed to the idea that people could disappear without explanation, and that life would continue as if nothing had changed. This understanding shaped her expectations. In later years, she did not assume permanence. She valued stability, but did not trust it completely. Instead, she learned to anchor herself internally, carrying a sense of continuity that did not rely on place or recognition. Egypt had taught her this lesson well. Back along the Nile, generations came and went with little awareness of the palace dramas that had once unfolded nearby. The land did not preserve hierarchy. It preserved habit. Flooding and harvest mattered more than lineage. Survival required cooperation with the environment, not allegiance to distant rulers. Over time, even monuments lost their authority. Stone weathered. Inscriptions softened. What had once demanded attention blended into the background of everyday life. People walked past carved walls without knowing whose victories they recorded. Memory loosened its grip. This was not failure, it was adaptation. History, like nature, sheds what it cannot sustain. Only fragments remain, floating briefly before settling into obscurity. Cleopatra's sisters became such fragments, referenced occasionally, rarely understood, never fully recovered. Yet their existence had shaped outcomes nonetheless. Every decision made in a palace corridor had rippled outward, influencing alliances, borders, and lives far removed from their origin. These effects persisted, even after their source was forgotten. Influence outlived identity. As evening approached again, the land prepared for rest. Heat softened. Shadows lengthened. The river darkened under the returning sky. Another cycle neared completion. There was comfort in this repetition. Nothing needed to be resolved tonight. The past had already settled where it belonged. The present continued without burden. The future waited patiently, unconcerned with attribution. Let your awareness drift with the light as it fades. What remains is not conflict or ambition, but continuity, the quiet agreement between land and time to keep moving forward together, undisturbed. And so the night returns, carrying with it the same calm that has always been here. Night settled again with familiar ease, wrapping the land in cooler air and deeper shadow. Lamps were lit one by one, their glow modest and contained, never meant to challenge the darkness, only to soften it. Along the river, reflections trembled gently, stretching and dissolving as water moved past unseen banks. In moments like this, the weight of history felt especially distant. The past did not press forward demanding recognition. It rested quietly, layered beneath the present like sediment at the bottom of the Nile. Life above it continued, supported by what had come before without needing to name it. Once, long ago, Cleopatra's sisters had watched evenings arrive in much the same way. From balconies or inner courtyards, they observed the city settle. Voices faded. Movement slowed. The palace shifted into its nighttime rhythm, more guarded, more introspective. This was the hour when thoughts grew louder, when plans formed silently and worries lingered longer than they did in daylight. Yet even these thoughts followed boundaries. Royal children were taught restraint, not only in speech, but in feeling. Emotions were acknowledged privately, managed carefully, and rarely shared. Vulnerability was a risk. Composure was a necessity. Over time, this discipline became instinct, shaping not only behavior but inner life as well. Arsinoe carried this discipline with her as pressure mounted. She understood that expression could be interpreted as weakness or defiance, depending on who observed it. So she learned to remain still even when circumstances shifted beneath her. Calm became a shield, though it could not stop every blow. Cleopatra Selene inherited this calm without knowing its origin. For her, emotional containment was simply the way the world worked. Feelings existed, but they were not meant to disrupt the surface of things. This understanding would allow her to move through unfamiliar environments later with quiet resilience. Elsewhere, beyond royal walls, Egypt breathed deeply into the night. Families gathered close. Stories were told softly, not for posterity, but for comfort. These stories rarely involved kings or queens. They concerned harvests, journeys, small joys, and minor hardships. They did not aim to last beyond the moment they were spoken. This, too, was a form of wisdom. While empires recorded themselves obsessively, ordinary life trusted impermanence. Words were allowed to fade. Experiences were allowed to pass. Meaning did not depend on endurance. As centuries unfolded, this balance held. Rome's presence in Egypt became normalized. New generations grew up without personal memory of the old dynasty. Cleopatra's image transformed into legend, while her sisters receded further into obscurity. What remained of them existed mostly in scholarly margins and fragmentary texts, studied briefly, then set aside. And yet, their lives had mattered fully while they were lived. They had woken to mornings, felt anticipation and uncertainty, made choices with limited information and imperfect control. They had existed within systems larger than themselves, just as everyone does, and responded as best they could. This truth did not require preservation to remain valid. As the night deepened, the world grew quieter. Sounds traveled farther, but occurred less often. The river's movement became more noticeable, a constant presence beneath the silence. It reminded the land that time was still moving, even when everything appeared still. If you allow yourself to drift here, there is nothing to hold on to. No single story needs to be remembered in full. No conclusion must be reached. Everything that needed to happen has already happened, and everything that remains will unfold without urgency. The sisters' lives have returned to the same place all lives eventually do, into the broad, quiet continuity of the world itself. Rest here now, where the river flows without interruption and the night asks nothing in return. The darkness grew softer as the night moved on, no longer heavy, but familiar and calm. Somewhere beyond the riverbanks, the desert cooled, releasing the heat it held through the day. Stars appeared gradually, not all at once, filling the sky in a way that felt unplanned yet complete. Egypt had always known this sky. Long before palaces, before dynasties, before the careful recording of names and bloodlines, people had looked upward and found reassurance in its repetition. The same patterns returned night after night, unchanged by human concerns. This constancy shaped the way time was understood here, not as something to be conquered, but something to live within. Cleopatra's sisters had grown beneath these same stars, though their lives were constrained by walls and expectations. They learned early that freedom did not always come from movement, but sometimes from acceptance. Knowing what could not be changed allowed attention to shift toward what could be endured. Arsinoe's awareness sharpened as her circumstances narrowed. She sensed when the space around her tightened, when choices quietly disappeared. Still, she carried herself with the dignity expected of her position, maintaining the composure that had been taught from childhood. Even as options closed, she remained present, fully alive within the limits imposed upon her. Cleopatra Selene, younger and more adaptable, internalized a different lesson. She learned that identity could survive relocation, that belonging was not always tied to geography. When Egypt fell away from her daily reality, it did not vanish entirely. It settled inside her, becoming something she carried rather than something she stood upon. This internal continuity sustained her through unfamiliar landscapes. In Roman cities where architecture rose sharply and streets echoed differently, she remained observant rather than reactive. She watched how people moved, how power displayed itself, how silence functioned. What she did not understand immediately, she learned to wait for. Waiting, after all, was something Egypt did well. Back along the Nile, the river continued to shape lives quietly. Fishermen rose before dawn. Farmers adjusted their work to the flood's timing. Children learned when to expect change and when to trust stability. These rhythms endured regardless of who claimed authority over the land. Over time, the distinction between past and present blurred. old stones supported new structures. Former centers of power became landmarks without context. The land absorbed everything evenly, smoothing sharp edges into manageable shapes. Memory adapted as well. What could not be carried forward easily was released. The sisters' stories became lighter with each retelling, until eventually they were no longer told at all. Silence filled the space where complexity once lived, yet complexity did not vanish. It simply dispersed. It moved into the soil, the water, the shared habits of living. It became part of the way Egypt continued, unconcerned with attribution. The land did not need to remember individuals to carry their influence forward. As the night neared its deepest point, stillness settled fully, the kind of stillness that does not feel empty, but complete. The world paused not in anticipation, but in trust. If you are still listening, there is nothing left to follow. The story has not ended because it was never meant to conclude. It continues in cycles, in repetition, in quiet persistence. The sisters' lives, like all lives, have become part of this ongoing movement. Let your thoughts drift with the river now, unanchored and at ease. Everything important is already in motion. The stillness of night deepened further, carrying with it a sense of timeless continuity. Somewhere along the Nile, the water's gentle motion reflected starlight, stretching silver threads across the surface, then folding them back again. The river moved with the patience of centuries, never hurried, never loud, always present. It had seen dynasties rise, sisters contend quietly, and children grow into roles they did not choose, yet it remained unchanged in its calm persistence. Within the palace, long since faded from prominence, echoes of lives once lived lingered softly. Corridors that had witnessed whispered strategies and careful observations were now empty, yet the air still seemed to hold a memory of intent, a residue of attention paid in silence. Lamps that had once glowed in anticipation of ceremonial tasks had burned low, then were extinguished, leaving only the faint scent of resin and lotus, carried slowly into the night. Arsinoe's presence, though long absent, was still imaginable here, not as power or drama, but as quiet determination, moving carefully through rooms with patient attention, observing without intrusion how authority and expectation shaped behavior, her composure serving as both safeguard and defense. Her awareness layered into the very rhythm of the palace's design, even as formal history erased her name. Cleopatra Selene, far from the city of her birth, carried these same lessons into unfamiliar lands, understanding that presence did not depend on recognition and that survival often meant blending rather than bending the world. Using observation as a tool, silence as a shield, and memory as a private refuge, learning to inhabit space without disturbing it, moving forward like the river itself without turbulence, yet without pause. Outside, Egypt slept beneath stars untouched by human concerns, fields absorbing cool night air, crops resting in predictable cycles, children sleeping beside parents, elders resting in courtyards, and the natural world continuing its steady rhythm, indifferent to dynasties and fading names. Time pulsed slowly and deliberately, the sisters' lives entwined within it, leaving subtle traces like ripples on water that were absorbed into the land, indistinct yet enduring, shaping the world quietly and without ceremony. History simplified what it recorded, selecting names and discarding complexity. Yet life itself retained every careful observation, every quiet choice, every act of endurance, allowing Cleopatra's sisters forgotten by chronicles to remain part of a larger continuity where influence existed without recognition. The river reflected the moon's steady progress. The air carried the scent of earth, water, and lingering incense from extinguished lamps. And the world continued unhurried, teaching patience through motion rather than words. The night stretched onward, the Nile flowing over reeds and stones with calm persistence, remembering without attachment, indifferent to what could not be changed, while the quieted palace held faint traces of footsteps and attention long gone, warmth lingering in stone and scent. Arsinoe's life remained traceable in pattern rather than record, her restraint and quiet adaptability embedded in routine and habit, while Cleopatra Selene carried her childhood observations as an internal compass through unfamiliar courts, able to listen without intrusion and endure without notice. Farmers rose with the river's timing, children played softly, elders rested. And past and present intertwined not as drama but as continuity, time smoothing sharp edges as Rome's order settled over Egypt without disrupting its deeper rhythm. Stars multiplied overhead, their reflections breaking and reforming on the Nile's surface, suggesting lives past, present, and future moving together in steady persistence, names fading while existence remained intact. Cleopatra's sisters, largely forgotten, had walked, observed, and endured, their choices rippling outward before being absorbed by the land itself, which preserved the pattern even as memory released the details. The night deepened fully, folding over the world with quiet permanence, the Nile continuing its silvered passage, impartial and patient, carrying forward the assurance that time moves on, that everything has settled into place, and that life continues gently, uninterrupted, and complete. Within the palace, long emptied of its inhabitants, traces of life persisted in subtle ways, as floors carried faint impressions of footsteps. Walls held echoes of whispered conversations, and the scent of incense lingered in corners untouched by light, while lamps no longer glowed yet left behind a remembered warmth that softened the darkness and spoke of routine rather than spectacle. Arsinoe's careful observation, quiet composure, and patient endurance shaped her environment even as history moved to forget her, the spaces she inhabited retaining the imprint of attention so that those who followed adjusted unconsciously to rhythms she had once set, her influence remaining subtle and enduring like ripples across still water. Cleopatra Selene carried similar lessons across distant lands, retaining the understanding that life could be navigated without command, that presence could exist quietly, and that observation often offered more security than assertion. Her early education in restraint and attentiveness, forming the framework through which she moved in unfamiliar courts and cities, blending without disturbance and observing without intrusion. Egypt itself persisted with quiet constancy as fields responded to the river's ebb and flow. Farmers adjusted to its cycles, children learned the patterns of work and rest, and the natural world continued in unbroken succession, indifferent to rulers and titles. Time moved like the Nile, shaping lives visibly and imperceptibly, and Cleopatra's sisters acted, observed, and endured within it, leaving subtle traces that outlasted recognition as decisions made in shadowed corridors quietly influenced alliances and outcomes even when history overlooked them. As night deepened, stars scattered across the sky and reflected on dark water, the river mirroring constellations in a quiet display of patience that held the assurance that life continues even when individual stories fade. The sisters' existences persisting in patterns of movement, routine, and environmental continuity. Life went on methodically as boats drifted along the river. Villagers tended small tasks, and the land remained patient while empires rose and fell and new names were carved into stone, continuity itself proving the truest measure of endurance. The night deepened further, and the land seemed to breathe with the river, every stone and reed carrying the quiet memory of countless lives, including those of Cleopatra's sisters, whose influence dissolved into rhythm and habit, imperceptible yet enduring like lengthening shadows. The Nile flowed with measured constancy, indifferent to ambition yet carrying traces of those who lived beside it. Fishermen repeating patterns shaped by generations before them. The river teaching that persistence outlasts recognition. Inside the palace, corridors remained calm and hollow, footsteps long gone yet subtly impressed. Warmth lingering in walls and shadowed corners where attention had once been given and absorbed, forming an invisible architecture that shaped the future without spectacle. Arsinoe's restraint functioned as unseen power, shaping routines and relationships even as history erased her name. While Cleopatra Selene, far from the Nile, carried Egypt within her through patience, quiet observation, and adaptability, understanding that presence mattered more than recognition and that survival often required stillness as much as action. Beyond the palace, Egypt maintained its rhythm as fields followed the river. Villages preserved ancient routines, and the land remained indifferent to imposed authority, while time layered generations gently. The sisters' lives leaving small ripples absorbed into everyday existence. Stars reflected faintly on the Nile, their scattered light suggesting all lives named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten flowing together within the river's patient rhythm. Continuity persisting even in absence as the sisters' quiet resilience became part of the unbroken cadence of the world. Life continued with gentle consistency. Boats drifted, animals stirred, and the river carried its soft murmur into the night. Each cycle of day and night, of water rising and falling, of breath inhaled and exhaled, reinforced the lesson that existence, above all, endures. Recognition may fade, names may be forgotten, and histories may simplify, but life, in its quiet continuity, persists. Let your mind move with this rhythm. Feel the river beneath the moonlight, the land beneath your feet, and the invisible traces of those who have lived before. Nothing needs to be remembered, nothing needs to be achieved, and nothing demands your attention. All has flowed into place, leaving only calm, continuity, and quiet endurance. The night deepened, settling over the land with a gentle, unhurried weight. The river moved steadily, carrying reflections of the stars along its surface, each ripple unfolding and fading as if to remind the world that nothing is permanent, yet everything endures. Its flow had witnessed countless lives, kings, queens, children, servants, and yet it remained impartial, its patience unshaken by ambition, rivalry, or the passing of time. Within the palace, now quiet and largely empty, the faint imprint of life lingered. Corridors held memories of footsteps, of careful observation, of quiet decisions made without spectacle. Lamps had long since gone dark, but the warmth of routines remained in the air, subtle and persistent. The architecture itself seemed to remember the careful spacing of rooms, the echo of voices, the soft rhythm of attention that once shaped the lives of those who walked there. Arsinoe's presence, though mostly erased from written history, had left its mark. Her patience, her composed observation, her ability to navigate spaces without demanding attention, these qualities shaped the environment, influencing patterns of behavior long after she had departed. The palace continued to operate within rhythms she had once helped set, and even without recognition, her impact endured in the quiet ways daily life persisted. Cleopatra Selene, far from her homeland, carried similar lessons within herself. She had learned early that presence could be maintained without acknowledgement, that survival often required stillness as much as action, and that careful observation could provide more security than assertion. Her childhood in Egypt had trained her to read subtle signals, to understand power without confrontation, and to endure when circumstances could not be changed. These skills guided her through foreign courts and distant lands, enabling her to navigate life with quiet resilience. Outside, Egypt continued its own rhythm. Farmers rose with the sun, adjusting their work to the cycles of the Nile. Children played in familiar routines. Elders rested in shaded courtyards, and daily life unfolded in patterns that had persisted for centuries. Even as rulers came and went, the land and its rhythms remained largely unchanged. Continuity flowed in the everyday, in planting, harvesting, tending livestock, and moving along familiar paths. Time passed gently, layering one generation upon another. The sisters' lives, though scarcely remembered, contributed to this unbroken rhythm. Small acts, careful decisions, and quiet endurance left ripples that shaped households, courtyards, and city streets. Influence did not always announce itself. Often it persisted subtly, shaping what followed without demanding recognition. The stars above reflected softly on the water, their light broken into gentle patterns across the river's surface. In this reflection, the continuity of all lives past, present, and yet to come could be sensed. Cleopatra's sisters, though largely absent from history books, existed in this continuity, their choices folded into the unbroken cadence of life along the Nile. Their endurance, patience, and quiet influence had become part of the land itself. Life continued with gentle regularity. Boats drifted slowly, currents carried water forward, and the night maintained its soft, unhurried rhythm. Even as human ambition ebbed and flowed, as empires rose and fell, the natural world endured, patient and impartial. Continuity, more than recognition, marked the passage of time. Let your thoughts move with this rhythm. Let your awareness drift with the river, the stars, the quiet land, and the subtle traces of those who lived long before. Nothing needs to be achieved or remembered. All has already settled into its place, leaving only calm, quiet, and continuity. The night stretched on, endless and gentle, as the land exhaled slowly beneath the moon's pale light. The river moved without interruption, carrying the quiet weight of centuries along its banks. Each ripple, each gentle curve of water, whispered the persistence of life itself, that events fade. Names are forgotten, yet the world endures, unchanged in its rhythm and its flow. Within the palace, silence had become its own presence. Rooms that had once hosted careful observation, whispered strategies, and cautious footsteps now held only echoes, faint impressions absorbed into walls and floors. Even the air seemed to remember the pattern of life, the measured rhythm of lamps lighting and extinguishing, the soft cadence of voices, the subtle awareness of presence that once defined the daily existence of those who lived here. Arsinoe's careful navigation of this space had left a lasting effect. She had moved with composure, observing without intrusion, influencing outcomes quietly. Even when history forgot her name, her influence persisted in the habits, routines, and spatial awareness she had instilled. The palace continued to function according to rhythms shaped long ago, a living reflection of her attention and restraint. Cleopatra Selene carried similar lessons within her, though far from her native land. Removed from the Nile and the city of her birth, she retained the skills of observation, patience, and quiet endurance that had been cultivated in her childhood. She understood that survival often depended on subtlety and that presence mattered more than recognition. With these lessons, she moved through foreign courts and unfamiliar territories with grace. Her identity rooted less in place than in her own enduring capacity to adapt and endure. Outside the palace, Egypt maintained its unbroken rhythm. Farmers tended fields according to the river's cycles. Children followed the familiar patterns of daily life, and elders rested as they had for generations. The land itself continued with patient consistency. The same patterns of planting and harvesting, of water rising and falling, of sun warming stone and soil, repeated year after year, century after century, indifferent to the rise and fall of rulers. Time layered itself gently. The lives of Cleopatra's sisters, though largely erased from historical record, contributed to this ongoing rhythm. Their choices, patience, and careful observation shaped spaces and relationships in ways that endured beyond their recognition. Influence does not always require acknowledgement. Often it is the unseen, subtle traces that persist most firmly. The stars above reflected upon the Nile, their light breaking into soft patterns across the surface of the water. In this quiet shimmer, the continuity of all lives could be sensed, those remembered, those forgotten, and those yet to arrive. Cleopatra's sisters, though largely absent from history, existed in this ongoing current, their resilience and endurance folded into the fabric of the land itself. Life continued with gentle, patient order. Boats drifted lazily along the river. Currents flowed steadily, and the land maintained its soft, unhurried rhythm. Human ambition rose and fell. Dynasties waxed and waned, yet the world persisted, carrying all that had been and all that would be into its ongoing flow. Continuity, not recognition, was the true measure of endurance. Let your thoughts follow the rhythm of the river. Let your awareness drift with the stars, the land, and the quiet presence of lives long past. Nothing requires action or recollection. All has settled into place, leaving only calm, quiet, and the gentle, unbroken flow of time. The night deepened further, folding the land into a soft, unbroken quiet. The Nile flowed steadily, carrying the moonlight across its surface in shifting silver threads, tracing patterns that repeated without effort. The water had seen everything, the rise and fall of dynasties, the quiet endurance of children, the careful attention of those who moved cautiously through palace halls, and yet it remained indifferent, moving forward without judgment or urgency. The palace, now largely empty, retained subtle traces of those who had once walked its corridors. Walls and floors seemed to remember footsteps, conversations, and glances, not as drama or spectacle, but as a pattern of presence. Lamps that had long been extinguished left a lingering warmth in the air, a faint echo of routine and attention. The rooms themselves seemed to breathe softly, holding the memory of lives lived quietly and deliberately. Arsinoe had learned to navigate these spaces with precision. Her attention to the smallest details, her restraint, and her patience shaped the environment long after she had departed. Even when history ignored her, the palace retained the imprint of her influence. The way people moved through space, the way decisions unfolded, the subtle alignment of relationships and habits that survived quietly in the absence of recognition. Cleopatra Selene, far from the Nile, carried similar lessons within herself. Distance did not diminish her connection to her upbringing. She understood that presence could be sustained without notice, that patience often ensured survival more than ambition, and that careful observation was a form of power. In distant courts and unfamiliar cities, she moved with quiet confidence. Her identity anchored not to place but to enduring resilience and adaptability. Outside the palace, Egypt maintained its enduring rhythm. Fields followed the cycles of the river. Farmers rose early to tend crops, children grew accustomed to patterns of work and play, and the land continued its steady cycles, indifferent to human ambition. The natural world, river, earth, and sky carried on in a quiet, unbroken cadence, reminding all who lived there that continuity mattered more than recognition. Time flowed gently, layering generations upon generations. Cleopatra's sisters, though largely absent from official records, left ripples in the fabric of life. Their choices, small and deliberate, shaped the behavior of others, leaving traces in routine and habit. Influence often endures silently. Through the patterns of life that survive beyond fame or documentation. The stars reflected softly on the river, scattering their light in gentle, moving patterns. In this quiet shimmer, one could sense the continuity of life. Those remembered, those forgotten, those yet to arrive. The sisters, though absent from history, existed in this continuity, their presence absorbed into the land. The routines of daily life and the unbroken movement of the river. Life continued with soft, measured consistency. Boats drifted, water flowed, crops were tended, and nights passed into dawn with quiet reliability. Empires rose and fell, names were inscribed on monuments and later erased. Yet the land endured, holding every subtle influence in its patient embrace. Continuity outlasted ambition, and quiet endurance outlasted recognition. Let your thoughts drift with this rhythm. Follow the river, the stars, and the land. Feel the echoes of lives long past, the quiet persistence of all that has happened, and the gentle unfolding of what is yet to come. Nothing demands attention, nothing requires remembrance. Everything has already settled into place, leaving only calm continuity and the unbroken flow of time. The night deepened further, stretching across the land in a soft, continuous expanse. The Nile flowed steadily, carrying reflections of stars along its surface, bending and breaking them into silver threads that shifted gently with the current. It had borne witness to the passage of countless lives of kings and queens, of children and servants, of strangers and travelers, and yet it remained indifferent, flowing with patient constancy, carrying everything forward without judgment or interruption. The palace, now quiet and largely empty, held the subtle memory of its former inhabitants. Floors retained faint impressions of footsteps. Walls absorbed whispers and glances, and the air itself seemed shaped by routine and attention. Lamps, long extinguished, had left only a lingering warmth in the spaces they once illuminated. Even in absence, the rooms remembered patterns of presence. The rhythm of daily life, the quiet discipline of those who had moved carefully through them. Arsinoe had moved through these halls with deliberate composure. Her attention to detail, her restraint, and her patient observation had shaped the environment, leaving traces that endured beyond her life. Even when history erased her name, the palace retained the imprint of her influence. The careful alignment of habits, the subtle shifts in behavior, the enduring cadence of movement shaped by her silent watchfulness. Cleopatra Selene, far from her homeland, carried similar lessons within herself. Distance did not diminish the resilience she had cultivated in her childhood. She understood that presence could be maintained without notice, that patience often ensured survival more effectively than ambition, and that quiet observation could shape outcomes more than overt action. In distant cities and foreign courts, she moved with this same composed awareness, grounded not in place but in enduring skill and perception. Outside the palace, Egypt continued its steady rhythm. Fields rose and fell with the river's cycles. Farmers tended crops according to seasons. Children followed familiar patterns of play and work, and elders rested in courtyards shaded from the sun. The natural world maintained its continuity. River, earth, and sky followed rhythms impervious to the rise and fall of empires, reminding all who lived there that the flow of life transcended recognition or fame. Time unfolded with quiet persistence, layering one generation atop another. Cleopatra's sisters, though largely absent from written history, left subtle ripples in the ongoing patterns of life. Their choices, their patience, their careful attention shaped the behavior of others and left enduring effects in the routines and habits of daily existence. Influence often persists without notice, embedding itself in the fabric of continuity rather than the pages of records. Stars scattered across the sky reflected softly on the river, their light broken and refracted by the gentle movement of water. In these reflections, one could sense the interweaving of all lives, those remembered, those forgotten, and those yet to arrive. The sisters, largely absent from history, existed within this continuity, their quiet resilience folded into the land itself, into the daily movement of people, and into the unbroken flow of the Nile. Life persisted with steady order. Boats drifted along the water, currents flowed unceasingly, crops were nurtured, and nights passed into dawn with calm reliability. Empires came and went. Names were recorded and erased, yet the land endured, holding all influence and memory, subtle or overt, within its patient embrace. Continuity outlasts ambition, and quiet endurance outlasts recognition. Let your thoughts drift with this gentle rhythm. Follow the river, the stars, the land, and the silent traces of those who lived long ago. Nothing demands attention. Nothing requires remembrance. Everything is already settled into place, leaving only calm, continuity, and the patient, unbroken flow of time. The night stretched on, soft and unbroken, carrying a quiet that had existed long before empires and would continue long after. The Nile moved steadily, its waters carrying reflections of the stars and the faint silver light of the moon across its surface. Every ripple was gentle, deliberate, and unhurried, a reminder that the world persists without need for attention or recognition. Time flowed here in patient continuity, and the river itself seemed to know this, moving steadily forward, indifferent to ambition, to names, to memory. Within the palace, absence had become a form of presence. The corridors that once held careful observation and whispered strategy now held only echoes and impressions, faint reminders of lives that had moved quietly through their spaces. Walls retained the memory of attention paid, and floors remembered footsteps even after the people had long departed. Lamps were extinguished. Yet their warmth lingered, not as light, but as an impression of routine, of care, of small acts repeated day after day. Arsinoe had understood the subtle power of observation. She had learned to move without intrusion, to influence without drawing notice, to endure without complaint. Even as history omitted her name, the impact of her presence survived in the patterns she established. The arrangement of space, the flow of activity, the alignment of behaviors that continued after she was gone. Her legacy was quiet, unrecognized, yet enduring. Cleopatra Selene, distant from her homeland, carried the same lessons within herself. She had learned that survival often required patience more than boldness, and observation more than declaration. She moved through new cities and unfamiliar courts with a composed attentiveness that allowed her to navigate challenges unseen, preserving herself in ways that names and titles could never ensure. Her connection to Egypt was internal, rooted in the enduring practices and rhythms of her upbringing rather than the location of her feet. Outside, Egypt persisted in its familiar rhythms. Farmers tended to their fields with the river cycles. Children played in the spaces between work and study. Elders rested in shaded courtyards. The land itself continued its quiet persistence. The sun rose and set, waters rose and fell, crops were planted and harvested. Empires might impose new laws and rulers might pass through, but the river, the soil, and the sky carried on with a continuity that outlasted any human ambition. Time unfolded gently, layering one generation upon another. Cleopatra's sisters, though largely absent from history, left subtle ripples in the flow of life. Their choices, attention, and endurance shaped routines and behavior, influencing those around them quietly yet persistently. Influence often endures in the spaces between recognition, embedding itself in the continuity of life rather than in written records. The stars above reflected softly on the Nile, breaking into gentle, shifting patterns on the water's surface. In this quiet shimmer, one could sense the flow of all lives remembered, forgotten, and yet to come moving together in unbroken continuity. The sisters, though absent from most records, existed in this current. Their resilience and quiet decisions absorbed into the land, the daily habits of people, and the unceasing rhythm of the river. Life continued in patient consistency. Boats drifted lazily along the water. Currents moved steadily, fields were tended, and night passed toward dawn with quiet reliability. Dynasties rose and fell. Names were inscribed and later erased, yet the land endured, holding all influence and memory within its steady embrace. Continuity outlasted ambition, and quiet endurance outlasted recognition. Let your mind drift with this gentle rhythm. Follow the flow of the river, the reflection of the stars, and the silent echoes of lives long past. Nothing requires action. Nothing demands memory, and nothing needs attention. All has settled into place, leaving only calm, patience, and the unbroken, enduring flow of time. The night deepened further, quiet and steady, folding the land into gentle shadows as the Nile flowed with soft persistence. Reflecting the faint shimmer of stars and the silver glow of the moon, its waters carrying a sense of continuity no human presence could alter. For empires rose and fell, names were written and erased, yet the river moved onward, patient, unhurried, and eternal. The palace, emptied of its inhabitants, retained subtle traces of lives once lived. With floors and walls holding faint impressions of footsteps and whispers, not as drama but as patterns of presence, lamps long extinguished yet leaving behind the warmth of routines, quiet reminders of observation, patience, and attention carefully given, the spaces themselves seeming to breathe softly, recalling the rhythm of life without disturbance. Arsinoe had understood how to move with care, her patience and attentiveness allowing her to influence outcomes quietly without declaration or spectacle. And even as history largely forgot her, the subtle structures she shaped remained embedded in routines, behaviors, and the measured flow of palace life, her legacy enduring not in recorded fame but in presence. Cleopatra Selene, far from Egypt, carried similar lessons within herself. Having learned to observe more than act, endure more than confront, and preserve her presence even when unseen, moving through foreign courts and unfamiliar cities with careful composure, guided by the rhythms of childhood and quiet discipline. Egypt existing within her rather than beneath her feet, granting her adaptability and resilience. Outside the palace, the land persisted in steady rhythm as farmers worked according to the Nile's cycles. Children followed patterns of play and study. Elders rested in familiar courtyards, and the natural world, river, soil, and sky continued its cycles unaffected by dynasties or political change. Continuity living in rhythm rather than recognition. Time passed gently, layering one generation upon another, and Cleopatra's sisters, largely absent from historical texts, left subtle traces in everyday life through decisions, patience, and quiet observation that shaped routines and behaviors without fanfare, influence surviving invisibly within existence itself. The stars reflected on the Nile, their light shifting with the movement of water, and in this quiet shimmer the flow of all lives remembered, forgotten, and yet to come could be sensed. The sisters' choices folded into land, river, and the unbroken cadence of daily life. Life continued with calm persistence as boats drifted, currents moved steadily, crops grew and were harvested. Nights passed into dawn with measured consistency. Dynasties came and went, names appeared and faded. Yet the land endured, carrying all influence and memory silently within its flow. Continuity outlasting ambition and quiet endurance outlasting recognition. Inviting thought to drift with the river, the stars, and the subtle traces of lives long past. Where nothing demands attention, nothing requires recollection, and everything has already settled into its place, leaving only calm, continuity, and the unbroken flow of time. The night deepened further, soft and expansive, stretching over the land in quiet waves as the Nile flowed steadily, carrying reflections of the stars and moon across its surface, each ripple a subtle reminder of time's patient passage. Having witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the careful movements of rulers, and the endurance of children and servants alike, yet remaining unaffected, moving forward with calm constancy, unhurried and unjudging. The palace, emptied of life, held only traces of the past, its walls remembering whispers of footsteps and the measured cadence of observation, floors retaining faint imprints of movement, lamps long extinguished yet leaving behind the subtle warmth of repeated routines, a gentle echo of patience and endurance. The space itself seeming to breathe, holding memory in quiet, shadowed corners. Arsinoe moved with awareness and composure, influencing outcomes without spectacle, guiding the flow of life with subtle restraint. And though history largely omitted her, her presence endured in the patterns she established, the alignment of behavior, the flow of activity, the quiet shaping of space, demonstrating that influence often persists invisibly within the rhythm of life itself. Cleopatra Selene, far from her homeland, carried these lessons within her, where observation became a shield, patience a form of strength, and quiet endurance a means of survival, moving through distant cities and unfamiliar courts with composed attentiveness. Guided by the rhythm of her upbringing rather than the external world, Egypt residing within her memory and patterns, anchoring her as she navigated each new environment. Beyond the palace, Egypt continued its steady rhythm as fields followed the river's cycles. Farmers tended crops in predictable patterns. Children played between work and study. Elders rested in familiar courtyards. And the land itself maintained continuity, indifferent to rulers, dynasties, or shifting politics, while water, soil, sun, and sky moved in unbroken cycles, proving that life's persistence outlasts ambition and fame. Time layered itself quietly, generation upon generation, and Cleopatra's sisters, largely absent from historical record, left subtle traces in everyday life through patience, careful observation, and endurance that shaped behavior and influenced outcomes without recognition. For influence survives most profoundly when woven invisibly into the rhythms of existence rather than recorded in inscriptions. The stars scattered light across the Nile, their reflections stretching, breaking, and shifting with the water's movement. And in this quiet shimmer, the flow of all lives remembered, forgotten, and yet to come could be sensed. Cleopatra's sisters existing within this continuity, their attention absorbed into land, river, and the steady cadence of daily life. Life continued with calm persistence as boats drifted along the river. Currents moved steadily, crops were tended and harvested, and nights passed into dawn with gentle consistency, empires rising and falling, names appearing and vanishing, yet the land enduring, carrying subtle influences and memories within its quiet, patient embrace, continuity outlasting ambition, and quiet endurance outlasting recognition. Inviting thought to drift with the river, follow the stars' reflections, and rest in the knowledge that nothing demands action, nothing requires memory, and everything has already settled into place, leaving only calm, continuity, and the gentle, unbroken passage of time. The night deepened still further, carrying a soft, steady calm across the land as the Nile flowed with patient constancy, reflecting the faint glow of stars and the pale light of the moon in shifting silver threads, each ripple moving gently, unnoticed yet deliberate, reminding all who observe that time persists quietly, carrying everything forward, indifferent to names, ambition, or memory. For empires had risen and fallen, dynasties claimed power and were erased. Yet the river continued, unhurried and eternal. The palace, emptied of its inhabitants, retained subtle traces of lives once lived. Corridors holding faint echoes of footsteps and whispers, walls remembering careful gestures and quiet observation, floors retaining the imprint of routine movement, and lamps long extinguished, leaving only a lingering warmth, not of light, but of rhythm and presence, of patience repeated day after day so that absence itself seemed alive, holding memory through measured attention and deliberate endurance. Arsinoe understood the power of subtlety, her careful observation, patience, and composure allowing her to influence outcomes without spectacle. And though history largely omitted her, the patterns she established endured in the flow of activity, the alignment of behavior, and the quiet shaping of space, proving that influence persists not in recognition but in the steady rhythm of life itself. Cleopatra Selene, far from her homeland, carried these lessons within her, where observation became a shield, patience a form of strength, and quiet endurance a means of survival. Moving through foreign courts and distant cities with composed attentiveness, guided not by acknowledgement, but by the inner rhythm of her upbringing. Egypt residing within her memory and anchoring her in continuity wherever she went. Outside the palace, the land followed timeless rhythms as farmers rose with the river's cycles. Children moved through familiar patterns of play and study. Elders rested in shaded courtyards, and the natural world, soil, water, sun, and sky continued its cycles indifferent to rulers, dynasties, or political change, showing that continuity exists not in fame, but in the unbroken flow of life. Time unfolded gently, layering generation upon generation. And Cleopatra's sisters, largely absent from historical records, left subtle traces in daily life through careful attention, restraint, and endurance that shaped routines and behaviors. Influence surviving most profoundly when unseen and embedded in the fabric of existence rather than celebrated in written accounts. Stars reflected across the Nile, their soft light broken and refracted by the gentle movement of water. And in this quiet shimmer, the continuity of all lives remembered, forgotten, and yet to come could be felt. Cleopatra's sisters existing within this flow as their resilience, patience, and decisions were absorbed into land, river, and the unbroken cadence of life. Life continued with calm persistence as boats drifted, currents flowed steadily, crops grew and were harvested, and nights passed into dawn with quiet reliability. Empires rising and falling, names appearing and fading, yet the land enduring, carrying subtle traces of influence and memory within its patient embrace. Continuity outlasting ambition and quiet endurance outlasting recognition. Inviting thought to drift with the river, follow the reflection of stars, and rest in the gentle echo of lives long past, where nothing demands action, nothing requires remembrance, and all has already settled into place, leaving only calm, continuity, and the soft, unbroken flow of time. The night remained soft and unbroken, stretching quietly over the land as the Nile moved steadily, carrying the silver glow of the moon and the scattered light of stars along its surface. Each ripple gentle yet deliberate, a quiet reminder that time flows with persistence, indifferent to ambition, recognition, or memory. For empires had risen and fallen along its banks and dynasties claimed and lost power, yet the river continued eternal and impartial, carrying the traces of all who had come before in its steady flow. The palace, now empty of life, retained subtle imprints of past inhabitants, corridors holding faint echoes of footsteps, walls remembering whispers and careful observation, floors carrying the soft imprint of repeated routines, and lamps long extinguished leaving only residual warmth. A quiet echo of patience and deliberate attention, so that even absence seemed alive, shaped by the rhythm of lives once lived with care and purpose. Arsinoe had mastered the art of quiet influence, her patience, composure, and observation allowing her to shape outcomes without spectacle. And though history largely omitted her, the patterns she established persisted in the careful flow of activity, the alignment of behavior, and the subtle shaping of space, proving that true influence does not demand recognition but endures silently, embedded in habit, rhythm, and persistence. Cleopatra Selene, far from Egypt, carried similar lessons within herself, where observation became a shield, patience a form of strength, and quiet endurance a subtle power. And in distant courts and unfamiliar cities she moved with composed attentiveness, guided by the rhythms of her upbringing rather than the demands of her surroundings. Egypt residing within her memory as a steady internal continuity that allowed her to adapt, survive, and navigate life with calm precision. Outside the palace, Egypt persisted in its quiet rhythm as farmers worked with the flow of the river. Children followed familiar patterns of play and study. Elders rested in shaded courtyards, and the natural world, the river, the soil, the sun, and the sky maintained its cycles indifferent to rulers, dynasties, or human ambition. Continuity found not in recognition but in the steady, unbroken flow of life itself. Time layered itself gently, generation upon generation, and Cleopatra's sisters, though largely absent from written history, left subtle traces in daily life through careful attention, endurance, and patient observation that shaped habits and behavior, leaving invisible imprints long after their names were forgotten. Influence surviving most strongly when unseen and woven into the ongoing rhythm of existence, rather than celebrated in monuments or records. Stars reflected on the Nile, their scattered light stretching and shifting with the water's gentle movement. And in this quiet shimmer one could feel the continuity of all lives remembered, forgotten, and yet to come. Cleopatra, sisters existing within this flow, as their presence was absorbed into the land, the river, and the steady, unbroken cadence of daily life. Life continued with calm persistence as boats drifted lazily, Currents flowed steadily, crops grew and were harvested, and nights passed into dawn with quiet reliability, empires rising and falling, names inscribed and erased. Yet the land enduring, holding subtle traces of influence within its patient embrace. Continuity outlasting ambition and quiet endurance outlasting recognition, inviting the mind to drift with the river, follow the shimmer of the stars, and rest in the gentle echoes of lives long past, where nothing demands action, nothing requires remembrance, and everything has already settled into place, leaving only calm, continuity, and the unbroken, enduring flow of time. The night deepened further, stretching over the land like a vast, quiet veil as the Nile flowed steadily, its waters reflecting the silver glow of the moon and the scattered shimmer of distant stars. Each gentle ripple moving without haste, reminding all who observe that time continues, carrying all things forward with patience and persistence, for empires had risen and fallen along its banks. Dynasties had claimed and lost power, yet the river endured, unhurried, impartial, and eternal, holding the echoes of all who had lived beside it. The palace, now emptied of its inhabitants, retained subtle traces of life long past, corridors holding faint echoes of footsteps, walls remembering quiet conversations and careful observation, floors bearing impressions of repeated movement, soft yet enduring, while lamps long extinguished left only a residual warmth in the spaces they once illuminated, a quiet testament to patience, routine, and deliberate attention, so that even absence itself seemed alive, shaped by the rhythm of lives once lived with care. Arsinoe had learned the art of quiet influence, moving with composure, patience, and observation, shaping outcomes and spaces without spectacle, her presence felt in the alignment of behaviors, the flow of routines, and the subtle adjustments others unconsciously adopted, and even as history largely omitted her, the patterns she created endured, proving that true influence often persists silently, embedded in habit, rhythm, and the steady flow of life. Cleopatra Selene carried these lessons far from her homeland, where observation became her shield, patience a form of strength, and quiet endurance a subtle power. And in distant courts and unfamiliar cities she moved with composed attentiveness, guided by the rhythms of her upbringing rather than external acknowledgement. Egypt residing within her memory, as an internal continuity that allowed her to navigate life with calm precision, adapting and enduring with quiet confidence. Beyond the palace, the land continued its steady rhythm as farmers followed the river's cycles. Children moved through familiar patterns of play and study. Elders rested in shaded courtyards. And the natural world, the river, the soil, the sun, and the sky persisted in unbroken cycles, indifferent to rulers, dynasties, or fleeting human ambition, continuity existing not in fame or recognition, but in the patient repetition of life itself. Time flowed gently, layering generation upon generation, and Cleopatra's sisters, though largely absent from historical records, left subtle marks in everyday life, their patience, careful observation, and quiet endurance shaping routines, influencing behavior, and leaving traces that endured long after their names faded, influence surviving most fully when unseen and woven into the rhythms of existence, rather than celebrated in monuments or texts. The stars above scattered their soft light across the Nile, broken and shifting with the gentle movement of water. And in this quiet shimmer one could sense the continuity of all lives, those remembered, those forgotten, and those yet to arrive. Cleopatra's sisters existing within this current, their choices and resilience absorbed into the land, the river, and the unbroken cadence of daily life. Life continued with calm persistence as boats drifted along the water, currents flowed steadily, crops were tended and harvested, and nights passed into dawn with quiet reliability. Empires rising and falling, names appearing and fading, yet the land enduring, holding all subtle influence within its patient embrace. Continuity outlasting ambition and quiet endurance outlasting recognition. The night stretched endlessly, soft and unbroken, folding over the land like a comforting veil as the Nile flowed with eternal patience, reflecting moon and stars in gentle, moving patterns. Time witnessing countless generations come and go, rulers and dynasties, children and elders, lives celebrated and forgotten while the river remained, impartial and unwavering, a constant witness to what had passed, what was passing, and what was yet to come. The palace seemed to breathe softly in the darkness, walls holding impressions of footsteps and hushed conversations, floors remembering steady rhythms of movement, lamps leaving behind warmth without light, and absence itself carrying the careful attention and endurance of lives once fully lived. Arsinoe's influence lingered in the quiet flow of daily life. Cleopatra Celine's endurance traveled across distant lands, and outside, farmers rose with the river, children played and learned, elders rested, and the sun rose and set with timeless regularity, the natural world carrying on regardless of power or ambition. Time layered itself gently, generation upon generation, subtle ripples of influence continuing unseen, stars reflecting softly on water, boats drifting with the current, crops growing and harvested, nights passing into dawn with steady calm, empires rising and fading while the land endured, holding every trace of life within its patient embrace. And as the night deepened still further, the river flowed without need for attention. Stars continued their patient watch. Wind brushed softly over sand and stone, and everything followed its quiet rhythm. Everything continuing, flowing forward, guided by patience, observation, and quiet endurance. Inviting the mind to drift with the river, follow the shimmer of stars, rest in the warmth of empty halls and the echoes of lives long past, until there was no rush, no demand, no need for recognition, only calm, continuity, and the unbroken movement of time, carrying all lives remembered and forgotten alike gently onward. The night continues without interruption, calm and expansive, holding the land in a gentle stillness that feels endless as the Nile flows on, its surface dark and reflective, carrying the soft glow of stars like scattered lanterns drifting across the water, each movement slow, deliberate, and unhurried. The river neither rushing toward the future nor clinging to the past, but simply moving, steady and patient, as it always has, offering reassurance in its quiet certainty that everything finds its place in time without force or struggle. Along the riverbanks the land rests, fields that once echoed with footsteps now lying still as soil cools beneath the night air. Palm trees swaying gently in subtle rhythm to a breeze carrying the faint scent of water and earth. Sensations unchanged for centuries. Sensations Cleopatra's sisters would have known in this same pause between day and dawn when the world seems to breathe more deeply. The palace remains silent, its stones cooled by night. What was once vibrant with careful conversation and controlled movement, now settled rather than abandoned. Time softening its edges until the urgency of power dissolves into resonant calm. Rooms no longer demanding attention but offering rest. Corridors no longer guiding strategy but holding stillness, shadows content to remain where they fall. Arsinoe's presence lingers in ways that cannot be measured, not in grand gestures or remembered speeches, but in the discipline of space and quiet order that once governed these halls. Her patience deliberate and rooted in observation, her trace enduring even as her name faded. Cleopatra Selene carried this understanding far from the Nile, learning beneath unfamiliar skies to let time work with her rather than against her, understanding survival as something quiet and gradual. Shaped by restraint and adaptability, her identity resting not in acknowledgement, but in continuity, memory, rhythm, and inner steadiness. Beyond palaces and borders, life continued as it always had. Villages settling into sleep, fires dimming, animals resting. The river awake but never restless, its movement a lullaby needing no audience as people were born, lived ordinary days, and passed on into the same quiet continuity that carried generations before them. Time did not announce itself, but layered gently, moment by moment, breath by breath, Cleopatra's sisters becoming part of this layering not as dramatic figures frozen in history, but as lives absorbed into a greater rhythm. Ambitions softened, struggles dissolved, leaving only the fact that they had lived, observed, endured, and contributed as they could. Above, the stars continued their slow passage, constellations shifting so gradually the movement was almost imperceptible. Mirroring history itself as change unfolded quietly, shorelines shifting, palaces fading, nothing sudden, everything transforming without violence or demand. The Nile reflected these stars in long wavering paths of light that formed, dissolved, and reformed endlessly. No reflection clinging to the water, each existing briefly and beautifully before giving way. Just as lives do, memory surviving not as something fixed, but fluid and adaptable. Cleopatra's sisters remaining now as impressions rather than sharp figures, a way of watching before acting. A habit of patience, a quiet strength that seeks no attention and passes unnamed from generation to generation. Night deepens further, and the world grows heavier with calm. Thought itself slowing, loosening its grip, nothing to solve, no questions waiting. History no longer demanding interpretation, but simply existing, settled and complete. The river flowing, the stars drifting, the land resting, everything exactly where it needs to be. As hours pass, the night remains kind, not rushing toward morning, allowing rest to deepen naturally as palace stones cool further. Air grows softer, memory fades into gentle awareness. Cleopatra's sisters no longer rivals or contenders, but part of the long human story. Lives that touch the world briefly and return to it, struggles no longer weighing anything down, ambitions no longer pressing forward. Only peace remaining, and within this peace there is space for rest. Thoughts slowing further. Moving like the river steady, effortless, unforced with nothing to hold on to, nothing to finish, nothing to remember precisely. The night holding everything, time continuing gently, and you free to rest within it. The stillness deepens not abruptly, but in the way quiet always deepens so slowly that it feels as though it has always been this way. The Nile continues its patient journey, water sliding past stone and reed with a sound so soft it barely registers, yet never truly stops. The river does not mark endings or beginnings. It does not divide past from present. It simply carries everything forward, smoothing edges, softening weight, and allowing all things to settle into their proper place. Along its banks, the land rests without effort. The soil cools. The air grows heavier, calmer. Even the smallest movements, the shift of leaves, the faint brush of wind across sand feel measured and intentional, as though the world itself has chosen to slow. This same quiet has returned night after night for thousands of years, unchanged in its essence, familiar to every life that has passed through it. The palace no longer asks to be remembered. Its stones have learned patience. What once stood at the center of attention now exists as part of the landscape, neither demanding nor resisting time. Walls no longer separate power from vulnerability. Rooms no longer hold tension. Everything has relaxed into stillness. The echoes that remain are not loud enough to disturb rest. They are gentle, distant, almost comforting. Arsinoe's careful presence dissolves here into something softer. Her watchfulness no longer guards against danger. Her restraint no longer measures risk. What remains is the calm residue of a life lived attentively. She becomes not a figure of rivalry, but an example of quiet endurance of existing fully without needing to dominate the space around her. Time accepts her easily, folding her into its steady rhythm. Cleopatra Selene too moves beyond distance and exile here. Borders fade, names lose their sharpness. What survives is not where she lived, but how she lived with patience, with adaptability, with a steady awareness that allowed her to endure without resistance. Her story no longer unfolds in moments of tension, but in the gentle persistence of breath and thought, carried forward long after circumstances have disappeared. Beyond royal lives, the countless unnamed lives continue their quiet presence. Farmers, sailors, children, elders, each absorbed into the same flow. None stand apart. None are singled out. Every life becomes part of the same shared movement, carried by water, land, and time itself. History here is not a sequence of events, but a continuous motion, smooth and unbroken. The stars above shift almost imperceptibly. Their light travels immense distances only to land softly on water and stone, asking nothing in return. They do not illuminate to be admired. They simply exist, steady and distant, offering quiet reassurance that movement does not require urgency. The river reflects them without effort. Light stretches, breaks, reforms. Nothing is held too tightly. Nothing resists change. Reflection follows reflection, moment after moment, each one complete in itself, each one ready to pass. This is how everything settles in the end, not through force, not through resolution, but through gentle continuation. The rivalries fade first, then the ambitions. Then even the stories soften, becoming impressions rather than narratives. What remains is rhythm, breath, flow. Thoughts slow naturally here. They no longer jump forward or backward. They drift, like the water, like the light, like the quiet itself. There is no need to stay alert. No need to follow a thread. The world does not require attention to continue. Night holds everything without effort. The land rests. The river flows. The stars keep watch. And within this steady, unbroken calm, nothing needs to be remembered clearly. Nothing needs to be resolved. Time continues its patient work, carrying all things gently onward, while rest arrives exactly when it should. The quiet remains, wide and forgiving, as if the night itself has slowed its breathing to match the land. The Nile continues on its ancient path, water sliding past water, never pausing, never hurrying. Its movement is so constant that it no longer feels like motion at all, but like a presence steady, reliable, endlessly patient. This is the same flow that once reflected palace lights, the same current that carried whispers, plans, and fears downstream until they softened and disappeared. Along the banks, everything settles more deeply now. The air cools just enough to be felt, not noticed. The ground releases the last warmth of the day. Even sound grows distant, as though the world has decided it has said enough. This quiet does not feel empty. It feels complete, full in a way that leaves nothing wanting. The palace no longer belongs to anyone. Ownership has faded, just as urgency has faded. What once held power now holds stillness. Stone walls do not remember conflict. They remember time. They remember waiting. They remember standing through sun and storm, through celebration and loss, until all moments became equal. In this state, the palace is no longer a place of rivalry, but a place of rest. Arsinoe's life dissolves here into calm continuity. No judgment remains. No unfinished struggle lingers. She is no longer defined by position or threat, but by the quiet fact that she existed, observed, endured, and then passed gently into time. Her awareness, once sharp and cautious, now rests. There is nothing left to anticipate. Cleopatra Selena's long journey also softens. Distance loses meaning. Exile becomes movement. Survival becomes rhythm. What once required effort now simply is. She no longer carries herself forward. She is carried, as all things are, by time's steady current. Her strength no longer has to prove itself. It can finally rest. Beyond these names, beyond royalty, beyond history, the countless other lives settle as well. Lives without records. Lives without conflict worth remembering. Days filled with work, rest, laughter, silence. All of them become part of the same gentle layering. The same quiet accumulation that builds the world not through events, but through persistence. The stars continue their slow passage overhead. Their light arrives softly, having traveled longer than memory can reach. It does not demand to be seen. It simply arrives, touches the river, touches the land, and moves on. The Nile receives it without hesitation, letting it stretch and dissolve across the surface, never holding it too tightly. Everything here understands this rhythm. Nothing clings. Nothing resists. Nothing rushes. Thought becomes lighter now, less structured. It drifts instead of moves. The mind does not need to hold a story anymore. The story has already ended, not with finality, but with calm acceptance. History has done its work. Time has smoothed its edges. The night does not ask you to follow. The river does not ask you to watch. The stars do not ask you to remember. They simply continue, and in that continuation, rest comes naturally. Not forced, not guided, just allowed, like the land cooling, like the water flowing, like the quiet settling everywhere at once. Everything is held, everything is carried, everything is at peace. The night has fully arrived now, complete and unhurried, wrapping the land in a calm that feels older than memory. The Nile flows on, steady and soft, its movement so familiar that it fades into the background of everything else. Water follows water. Moment follows moment. Nothing interrupts the rhythm. The land rests without effort. Stones cool. Reeds barely move. The air becomes smooth and even, as though the world itself has settled into a deep, comfortable stillness. There is no need for attention here. No need to listen closely. Everything important is already happening on its own. The stories that once filled this place have softened completely. Rivalries no longer echo. Names no longer call for remembrance. What remains is not history, but continuity, the gentle assurance that life moved forward, that time carried everything exactly where it needed to go. The stars keep their quiet watch above, distant and patient. Their light drifts down without urgency, touching river and land before slipping away again. Nothing holds on, nothing needs to. The night understands how to let go. Breath slows naturally now. Thoughts grow fewer, lighter, less defined. The mind no longer reaches forward or back. It rests where it is, supported by the steady presence of the dark, the flow of water, the calm of the land. Everything is safe. Everything is held. Everything is allowed to rest. The river will keep flowing. The stars will keep moving. The night will remain gentle and wide. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to follow, nothing left to remember. Only rest remains. Good night.